Hello and welcome everyone to the Storytime Basics webinar. I have a few announcements before we get started. To register for other webinars or trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library, and it's under Services for Libraries. If you're watching a recording of this webinar, instructions on how to obtain your LEU certificate are in the video's description on YouTube. Okay, I think we're ready to get started, and my slides are already up. So let's do this. Okay, hello again, welcome to Storytime Basics. My name is Beth Yates, and I am the Children's Consultant at the Indiana State Library in our Professional Development Office. I've been here for over 6 years now, but before I came to ISL, I was actually a children's librarian in a public library for 12 years, and I did all kinds of programming for youth. Our department served babies through about 5th grade, and that absolutely included plenty of story times through the years. So while it has been a few years since I did story times myself, I definitely have lots of years of experience doing them, and it's something that sticks with you. So happy to share my experience here today. And before we get any further, I want to sing a hello song for you that I used to use because it seems appropriate. We're at the beginning, just like the beginning of a story time, to sing hello. And I hope that you can stay muted, but you'll at least wave along with me to yourself if you want, just so I'm not totally alone. But you're gonna get our hands all warmed up and ready, and we're gonna wave them like this, and it goes, hello everybody, and how are you? How are you? How are you? Hello everybody, and how are you? How are you today? Yay! Good job, everybody. So you can see it's a super simple hello song, and people can catch on pretty quick, and they can at the very least wave along with it. So that's why I liked it a lot. All right. What is the objective today? What do I hope you'll get out of this? Well, I really hope that you will leave understanding why we do story times. And even more importantly, if you're new or newish to story time, I hope that you'll leave here feeling like you know where to start, what you should include, and where you can find more information for planning. And just a quick reminder, as it said in the registration description, this training is definitely geared towards those who are new to doing story time. I know we have a few folks here with lots of experience, and that's great. Totally glad to have you. And I hope that you folks with more experience will help me out today by sharing your ideas and your thoughts in the chat as we go. So that being said, we're going to start with the why. Why do we do story times? Then we'll spend most of our time discussing the how-to and the content of story times. I have some other tips and resources that I hope will help you. And then I want to end with hopefully time, like I said, for questions, discussion, and idea sharing. And crowdsourcing problem solving too is always a great thing to do when we're all together. If you're someone, again, with Storytime experience, I hope you consider sharing some of your favorites today as I ask in the chat and at the end. And I'll certainly be sharing some of mine. So we're going to start with that question of why story times? Why do we even do story times? Why do you all think that we do story times? What can you share in the chat? This could be why your library says that you do story times, or it could be why you think you do story times. What are some reasons why we might do story times? To encourage reading and learning, make reading fun, help children develop pre-literacy skills. Awesome, great. Early literacy, yeah. Help kids with literacy skills, to bring families together and meet other families. help introduce early literacy skills, and help caregivers know how to encourage those skills too. Oh yeah, Danielle. Build community. Yeah, that's a great one. These are all really great reasons. And, truthfully, each library might have their own reasons and goals for doing story time. In fact, I encourage you to ask yourself this question periodically about all of your programming. Why do we do any programming in the library? Why do you do specific programming for each age level, etc.? And make sure you discuss it with your coworkers and your supervisors so you're all on the same page about why you're doing your programs. It's good for a library to know why they do any program, and that reason should really be their own. It should be based on their community's needs. So story time is really one of the first things that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think of libraries. Maybe they had a positive experience when they were a child, or maybe they brought their own children. But it's truly a cornerstone of library programming for youth. Even if libraries don't do other sorts of programs, they usually do some sort of story time. Just a little history: children's departments and children's collections, and in fact, children's books, weren't really a thing until the late 1800s. They didn't always make books for kids. And slowly, though, as they came into more popularity through the early 1900s, story hours also became more widespread in libraries. So as the books came, so did the story hours. So story time has been prevalent in libraries for about a little over 100 years. And the focus was always on children and exposing them to good books. That was kind of we want to expose them to good literature. That was kind of the beginning in the early days. And I think that's still a valid reason for story time, along with, as you all said, just providing a fun bonding activity for kids and caregivers, introducing them to library services, get them in the doors at a young age, create those positive memories around books and around the library. But as a couple of you did mention, it can and it probably should be more than just that, because Storytime provides us with great opportunities to reach young children and their caregivers to share with them a little bit more about early literacy. So good job, everybody who said early literacy. You hit the nail on the head there for sure. About 20 years ago in 2004, I can't believe it's been 20 years, but in 2004, Every Child Ready to Read came out. Some of you have probably heard of it, maybe even been through a training. The Public Library Association and the Association for Library Services to Children, so the PLA and ALSC, which are both subdivisions of the American Library Association, the ALA, they looked at some studies that had come out in the early 2000s, and they concluded that libraries could have a greater impact on early literacy if they just focused some of their attention on the caregivers attending with the children and sharing early literacy tips with them. So how many of you have been through an Every Child Ready to Read training? It could have been maybe I did it for you in person before the pandemic, or maybe you've done the online version, because I have created a self-paced course I will link to that in the resources. So if you haven't taken ECRR before, you can still do that. I really recommend it. How many of you have done it? Yeah, we've got some thumbs up, some hand raises. Oh, great. You did the online version. So in that training, it explains the original 6 skills and the current 5 practices of Every Child Ready to Read. And it tells you or gives you some ideas for incorporating them into story time. So it's kind of like taking this training and then going a little step further. So I'll share that link out with the resources that I'm going to share later. But the most basic info that you just need to know today is that Every Child Ready to Read encourages caregivers to talk, sing, read, write, and play with their young children from birth through around age 5 or 6, because doing those things will help kids gain the early literacy skills that they need so that they are prepared to learn how to read when the time comes to learn how to read, which is usually around kindergarten. So Storytime became more about modeling best practices for caregivers, as well as directly sharing tips and activity ideas with the adults so that they better understand what they can do at home with their kids. And just a side note, there is also a relatively recent push to encompass all of school readiness when doing story times and other programming for young children. And all this really means is that in addition to the reading literacy portion, also kind of incorporating when you can things like numbers and basic math skills, grouping, writing numbers, identifying numbers, and then also interpersonal skills like cooperation, listening, and things like that. All skills that they'll need when they get to school. And you probably do a lot of that naturally anyway. So I'll actually be offering a training called Reimagining School Readiness this fall with my colleague, Suzanne Walker, that will cover a lot of those different ideas and topics. So if you're interested in that, keep your eyes peeled. It'll be in August, and it'll be actually available virtually and in person. And we hope to announce it in early May. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, so that's just a general overview for why we do story time and a little bit of the history of it in the public library. Are there any questions or comments about that why? You can share them in the chat if you do. Okay, don't see anybody jumping to add anything, so I'm going to go ahead and keep going, but if you come up with a question, throw it in the chat and I will get to it. Okay, so now we're going to focus for the rest of this training really on how to plan and actually do story times. All right, so when you're planning a story time, the first thing that you need to consider is your audience. Who are you planning this for? A traditional story time is generally considered to be a preschool story time. It's the one you hear the most often, referred to as preschool story time, right? So in the library land, in the library world, preschool is generally thought of as ages 3 or 4 through 5 or 6. So for instance, my old library welcomed kids ages 3 through kindergarten at our preschool story times. Plus we did story times for babies, for 1-year-olds, and for 2-year-olds. But not all libraries will break it down like that. It really depends on the size of your community, your typical attendance. So obviously, if you've got just hordes of people at your story times, you might need to try to do more if you're able. If you've got very small attendance, maybe you need to consolidate your story times a little so you have more in one story time. It also definitely depends on the number of library staff you have to cover those various age ranges and a whole lot more. So, many libraries do lump all or many of those groups together, and that's just fine. One other way they sometimes separate them is pre-walkers. So that'd be like the baby infant story time, and walkers. So anyone who can walk and older can go in the same story time at some libraries. The bottom line is do what you and your library can manage. All that being said, for the purposes of this training, we are going to break it into the 3 groups, babies, toddlers, and preschoolers, so that we can kind of look at some of the differences in expectations that you can have for story times at different ages. So the first one is babies, which we're saying is 0 to 12 months, so literally up to 1 year. And again, there's definitely going to be a huge range within that because you go from infants in arms to little toddlers who are just starting to walk probably. But for the most part, this is going to be a lap sit program. Babies are going to need to sit on the laps of their caregivers. And that could be held or just sat on a knee, whatever. The focus for these story times, I think, usually tends to be on the caregivers. Because the children are so young that you're definitely focusing more on the adults. For one thing, a lot of times it's the first time these adults are getting out of the house with a young baby and they just want to be with other people who have babies, so they can compare notes, so that they can not feel so alone. And so it can be a little bit of a socialization opportunity for them. And so you have to expect that. And in fact, you might even want to encourage it. Definitely keep it short for this age range. You know, obviously babies don't have much of an attention span, but in addition to that, you're dealing with feeding times, with nap time, with just, you know, getting tired and a little grumpy. And so just keeping it short is really ideal. For these story times, I recommend focusing almost completely on songs and rhymes, not really using too much in the way of actual books. I'm going to show an example here in a little bit, and you'll see what I mean by that. But maybe one book that is very interactive. Other than that, lots of bouncing and finger plays and just rhymes and songs that they can experience together. And giving them tactile experiences is really ideal. Of course, we all learn through our senses. That's how we experience the world. But for babies, this is to like the nth degree, because they are experiencing everything through touch and taste, taste being a big one. You know, babies put things in their mouths and they will put books in their mouths. So that's what board books are for. If you are new to the library world and you hadn't heard that before, just a heads up, it's not just so that babies can, you know, throw them around without breaking them. It's also actually so they can put them in their mouths without completely destroying them too. So, you know, that's why it's a good idea to wipe down your board books every once in a while. And it gives them a chance to experience the book and get comfortable with the book in all ways. Moving up to toddlers. So for this, we're kind of saying 1 and 2 year olds, so 12 months to 36 months. They have a very wide range of abilities. So certainly the ages 0 to 12 months is when probably the most brain growth is happening in your life, but it continues and you're still having a ton of brain growth from 12 to 36. And so the abilities of a 12-month-old versus the abilities of a 3-year-old are going to be pretty different. So still using mostly songs and rhymes with maybe 1 or 2 books is what I have found works the best. They want to move and investigate, you know, a lot of them are early walkers, especially on the younger age range. So they're just getting used to it and they want to do everything. They want to move, they want to groove. So again, be prepared for that. Caregivers should really still be in the room. The babies are still in need of some of that kind of supervision, so you're not alone in there trying to juggle a bunch of toddlers. Oh my goodness, that is exhausting to even think about. So definitely need the caregivers in the room. And for this one, I would max it out at about 30 minutes for this age group. Short and sweet. And then the last group, preschool, ages 3 to 5. They can definitely sit and listen a little bit longer. So you can do more and longer books, although still not like novels. Give them chances to move around. Again, they're still a little squirmy. They need those movement breaks. They want to share what they know with you. They're very verbal, a lot of them. Not all of them, but many of them are pretty verbal, and they like to tell you what they have learned, tell you what they know, tell you about their dog, or, you know, whatever's happening in their life that is important to them. So again, going in with those expectations that they might want to talk. And caregivers, I usually have said are optional, at least in the ones that I used to do. We used to say, if you feel like your child would benefit from you being in the room, then we encourage you to be in there. But if they don't want you in the room, you don't have to. But we did ask that they all stay in the children's department Definitely don't leave the library, and just be within a open the door and yell for you range. And then we would also always call the parents in during the craft. And finally, these story times can be a little bit longer. I usually aimed to do 30 to 40 minutes of the stories, songs, and books, or songs and rhymes. And then we would do the craft and have a playtime at the end that would kind of fill out the hour. Any questions about all of that? And we will dig a little deeper into some of these things as we go. But if you have questions, let me know. Well, I get a drink. Does that make sense to everybody? Craft for toddlers? Yeah, so Gail, we will talk about that a little bit. Yeah, sure. I'd say anytime you can fit a craft in is great. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but again, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. Let's talk about content. And we're going to start with how to select books. And Kylie, we'll talk about your question later, okay? So what makes a good story time book? Here is just one random example of what I would personally call a not so good story time book. Anyone have thoughts about why I would say that? I mean, it's a classic book. It came out in 1928. This style is pretty typical for that era. Lots of people have enjoyed this book over the years. But what do you notice? Taya says no colors. We've got a lot of text or too many words. Anything else? Lots of words, no colors. Doesn't look interesting. Why doesn't it look interesting, Christina? Any thoughts about that? Because there's no color? Okay. No colors. So color is a big one for all of you. How about the size of those illustrations? Yeah, Erin, small details. They're really tough to see. Really tough to see. Yes, you've all really hit the nail on the head. It is not very visually appealing. I mean, the font that is being used looks almost like it's been hand drawn. So it's hard enough to read when it's up close, but when it's far away, I'm sure it would be hard for kids to identify the letters or the words if you're trying to share with them. The pictures are very tiny. No color, all those things. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I don't mean to say that this is a bad book that should never be read, though. It's totally an example of a book that is potentially great for caregivers to share one-on-one with a child. They can get up close and see those pictures. If the story is too long or too wordy, they can take a break or they can skip parts. And if a child enjoys this book, that's awesome. It's just not ideal for story time. So if Millions of Cats was not the best for story time, how about this one? It's Five Little Chicks by Dan Yacarino. What do you notice about this random page that I selected? Oh, great, Danielle. Danielle's read this at home with her kids. Oh, that's great. Yes, Madeline, it is a counting book. Counting books are great. Very colorful, large pictures. The comments are flying by. There's some sound words incorporated. A lot less words. Yes. Yes, those are all excellent reasons. It's rhyming. I don't know if anybody said that. The comment may have flown by too quickly, but it's a rhyming book. Rhyming books are wonderful. There's not too much text. There's big, bold pictures. You can easily see they're colorful. Now, that's not to say that a book has to be in color to be interesting. In fact, I actually had this example right here on my computer. Kitten's First Full Moon by Kevin Hinkes is a black and white book, but it is still super engaging. I don't know if you can see that. I'm probably too small right now, but take a look at it. It's a Caldecott Award winner, and it's a wonderful book, and it is black and white, but it has big, bold pictures. It has rhyming and a really compelling story, and it's not too long either. One other thing that you might look for in picture books is, and maybe you didn't know because this is something I didn't used to know, but picture books are written with a higher vocabulary level than, for instance, an intro, like an early reader book, because those early reader books are meant for kids to read themselves. Picture books are actually meant for adults to read to children. And so there's usually a lot of vocabulary that you might not use in everyday conversation. And so it's a really good way to introduce new vocab in context to kids during story time. So for instance, in this one, he says, "Phew, I'm all tuckered out." Tuckered, I don't say that very often, but it's a word that they can hear in context. And maybe when they go to read here in a couple years, it will be a familiar word to them and they'll be able to read it more easily. If you have any favorite picture books that you like to use during story time, feel free to share those in the chat as I continue on. The other thing I want to mention when I'm talking about selecting books is do try to seek out books that include some diversity whenever possible. This infographic is from the Cooperative Children's Book Center in Wisconsin. You may have seen it before, and it demonstrates representation of different diverse groups in children's books. And the fact is, one of the greatest things we can get from books and reading at any age is empathy and an understanding of other people and of the world. So it's really important to make sure that we're showing participants in our story times a variety of people and a variety of stories. You may have heard that books can be both a mirror and a window. So it's a mirror that you're holding up so you can see yourself. So maybe you know you're not alone. And it can also be a window so you can see out and see people that you maybe don't see regularly or that you don't know that much about yet and can learn more about them. And certainly people of color deserve to see themselves represented in books in our story times, especially if they're in your story times, but even if they're not. So I have included some resources for locating diverse titles on the resource sheet. And I want to acknowledge also here that I'm not really addressing sensory story times today. I know we had a question and we can talk about it a little bit later. Yeah, sure, Gail, absolutely. It should be all sorts of people. I'm not really addressing sensory story times today. Those that are designed for the neurodivergent, kids who are differently abled or who are on the autism spectrum. I am providing some resources though on the resource sheet and articles if you want to look into that further. And like I said, we can address the question from earlier about that too, about using songs in those story times. All right, reading aloud, how to read aloud. It's a skill that you're not really born with. If you have never done it before, it will almost definitely take practice to do well, and that is totally okay. In the chat, tell me, what do you think are some of the most important things to think about when you're reading out loud? Any ideas? And thanks for sharing all those book ideas. Speaking slowly and clearly, speed, not going too fast, project your voice. Take your time. Voice fluctuation, yeah. Make sure everyone can hear you and see the pictures. Yes, yes, yes. Kathy says different voices. If you can, absolutely go for it. Pronunciation, make sure they see the pages. Expression, yes. Even if you can't do voices, you can definitely still use different inflection when you're reading. Make sure you show the pictures. Try to point to the words as you read. Interact with the pictures, asking questions. These are all Excellent. Thank you. So I had how to hold the book. So, again, like many of you said, make sure they can see the pictures. In an ideal world, you're holding the book probably to your side. I usually held it about head level for me, nice and wide and open. And if you have to hold it in a certain position in order to read it, then make sure you're pausing and you're holding it out. And I know, again, with the camera, it's not as easy, but you're holding it out and you're moving it slowly around the room and giving all the kids a chance to look at it for sure. We said using inflection. Somebody, Aaron at the end said asking questions. Yes, something called dialogic reading, dialogue. It's having a conversation while you read the book. So it's asking open-ended questions about what they see, asking them to maybe predict what's going to happen next, or count what's on the page, or what do they think is going to happen, or what color is that? Just depending on the age level that you're working with will certainly affect the kinds of questions you can ask them, but having a conversation and letting them talk about the pictures is great. Now, you don't need to do this with every single book or every single page. It's great to pick one, maybe 2 pages of story time, and do it with those. Otherwise, you'll just be talking the entire time, which is fun too, but okay. Any questions about that or any other suggestions for things you think you should do when you're reading out loud? Okay. Oh, Taya says, I play I Spy. That's a good one. That's a good one. And you could do that with the book or without the book. Themes. Let's talk about whether to theme or not. This is the age-old question with story times. Should you use a theme? When I first started doing story times, I actually did not use themes. I kind of did the opposite. Some folks start out using themes and move to not using themes. I started not using themes, and then I ended up using themes eventually. But when I first started, I would really just pull the most recent books that we had gotten in that I liked, and I just used those along with stories and songs, or along with songs and rhymes, sorry. And I didn't try to theme it in any way. I just did what I liked and what was fun, and it worked. It was fine. It was great. But after a while, I personally found that using themes gave me direction. It helped me plan a little bit better because I had kind of a goal of what I was looking for. Now that is limiting to some people. And if it limits you, then don't use themes. That's okay. But for me, it helped. There's definitely positives for both. Share in the chat whether you think that you would be team theme or no theme. And if you've given it some thought, also share why you prefer that one over the other one. You do both? Okay, cool. Christina does both also. Yeah, there's definitely not a one or the other. You don't have to do one or the other. Molly's team theme. Silver does both. Yeah, helps focus on what to include. Give sync to the day. Oh, never even heard of not having a theme. Well, I'm telling you today, if you don't want one, you don't have to have one. But if you like it, keep doing it. Usually a theme, it sounds like themes seem to be theme-ish, Megan says. Oh, a letter of the day. Okay. That's a fun theme. So Molly plans around the craft first, picks the craft and then determines what to read. Okay. I mean, those are all totally valid ways and reasons for doing it, how you want to do it. I will share one other way, and maybe some of you who say you do both, maybe this is kind of what you do, I don't know. But one of the best resources that I found for story time is a site called Jaybrary. Probably some of you are familiar with that one. And I'll share more about it later, but They did a really great post where they talk about how they don't do themes anymore. Instead, they do what they call Storytime flow instead. And I have an example of that. This is from their website. So the way that this is flow is it starts out with the songs, put your hands up high, which I will sing for you really quick. Put your hands up high, put your hands down low, put your hands in the middle and wiggle just so. Put your elbows in the front, put your elbows in the back, put your elbows to the side and quack, quack, quack. So it's a duck. You sing about a duck, and they read Firefighter Duckies, also about ducks, obviously. But then they do Hurry, Hurry, Drive the Fire Truck. So it goes from ducks to fire trucks is the common theme. And then they say, we talked about firefighters. What about another career, astronauts? And they sing zoom, 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 we're going to the moon. And then they move into talking about the sky. So what else can you see in the sky? You can see clouds. And so then they tell the story, which is actually a book that they do a felt story. They cut out the shapes with the felt. It Looked Like Spilt Milk by Shaw, which is about clouds actually. And then it goes to two little blackbirds sitting on a cloud. And then from there it goes to birds. Hooray for birds. So it definitely is a progression throughout, and they kind of connect one book or activity to the next one, but they don't worry about connecting everything through the whole thing. So that's kind of a nice one. A nice way to do it too, I think. Anybody ever do story times like that? Yeah, great. I like it. It does have a nice flow to it. I feel like it probably is a little more work because you're definitely searching for those connections, but sometimes you can make the connections pretty easily. So story times are not just books though, of course, as we hopefully know. I've definitely talked about it so far in this training, or mentioned them, but it is so important to break up the stories with all of the things that you see here. Songs, finger plays, and rhymes are all very closely related, of course. You can use lots of classics like Twinkle, 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 Little Star, which is both a song and a finger play, really. Or you can play recorded songs. You can always play recorded music, although I personally am a fan of singing most of the time, even if you're not great at it, because it shows parents that you don't have to be a professional singer. And there are many excellent benefits to singing with kids, which Every Child Ready to Read does talk about. But finger plays are often just rhymes or songs with hand motions, like I said. They're great for the fine and gross motor skills, which, just a heads up, those are super important because when kids go to learn how to read, or when they start coloring, which is the early stages of that, they have to be able to have the hand strength to hold the pencil or the crayon, and they'll need those fine motor skills in order to make the shapes of the letters effectively. Moving on to flannel boards. Flannel boards can be full stories that you tell with flannel pieces, or you can just do simple rhymes with visual aids. I'll show one later, or I'll tell you about one later. Manipulatives, those are anything you can hand out to the kids, like scarves, shakers, bean bags, rhythm sticks, bells. Again, excellent for fine motor skills and hand strength, and they're often used rhythmically, and they're called manipulatives because they can manipulate them with their hands. Kids love puppets, of course. You don't have to be a professional puppeteer and voice actor to use a puppet, I promise. If you are, fantastic. I would love to see your puppet shows. But if you're not comfortable with that, you don't have to. They don't have to even talk necessarily. They can just be used as a prop and the kids will still love them. And then finally, movement. I added this one to represent any opportunity you can give them to dance, jump, move around, get those wiggles out to music, use their listening ears for the hokey pokey or Simon Says, touch their toes, act like animals. There are so many fun ways that you can move in story time. Crafts and play are also super important. Crafts are a classic storytime activity. They're usually done at the end of the planned stories, songs, and rhymes. And crafts may seem like just a bonus activity that you could potentially skip, but especially for those preschool age kids and even the toddlers, it's a fun way for them to practice hand-eye coordination, hand muscle strength, and fine motor skills. Plus, of course, they get to use their creativity. And I know we had a question about this earlier. Did I think that you needed them for toddlers? I'd say you don't need them for babies. But once they get to be 1 and definitely 2, yes, Kathy says people come for the crafts. A lot of times families love the crafts just because it's a chance for their kids to get to do crafts and they don't have to get messy at home. So that's another added benefit too. Just a heads up that nowadays it's generally considered, and you might be aware of this, hopefully you are, it's generally considered to be best practice to offer less structured crafts and instead focus on the process of crafting. I mean, you could still have a structured craft, but don't worry so much about whether it ends up looking like the example. Some kids prefer to have an example and need an example. And so it's okay to offer an example and to have a structured craft, but you want the kids to be the ones who are doing the hands-on, who are experiencing it, because that's how they get the benefit of the fine motor skills, the hand muscle strength, things like that. So it's usually just a matter of trying to encourage the parents to let the kids do it themselves and not take over. Because sometimes you do get parents who are like, oh, you're not doing it right. It's like, no, it's okay. It doesn't have, there's not a right or wrong way, I promise. Your moms do their own, that's great. If you can provide the parents with their own craft, that sounds like a great way to potentially encourage them to stay away from their child's craft. And then as far as play goes, some stories like to offer an unstructured play time after story time. So at my old library, we used to pull out some toys like a flannel board and some flannel shapes, a whiteboard and some magnetic letters, or puppets, maybe play pretend toys like a toy cash register, because play is one of the Everchild Ready to Read practices, and kids get so much out of play. They learn to work with other kids and take turns. They learn that one thing can stand in for something else, which is, a symbol. Something can be a symbol for something else. So like a pot can be a drum. And just a heads up, the alphabet is a series of symbols that stand in for different sounds. So understanding that concept is really important. There's just so many great benefits to play. So if you can do it at the end of your story time, fantastic. If you can't, that's okay. Maybe you can have some toys, or maybe you already have some toys out in your department. I know a lot of libraries had to take those out during COVID, but also I know a lot of them are starting to bring them back out again. So that's great. Oh, thanks, Robin. Thanks for sharing that book. Okay. Yes, Erin says it helps let the parents interact a little bit during the crafts and play after story time. Okay, does anyone have questions about the content before we move on to a couple of examples? Or comments about the content? Okay. All right. So let's move on to some sample story time outlines. There is absolutely no right or wrong way to organize your story times. Some libraries require their staff to enter their story time into some sort of form. Other libraries are much looser. My library was quite loose about it. And so we could do whatever we wanted to. And so I would make outlines for myself, but there's no right or wrong way to do it. I tend to prefer more structure personally, at least to begin, so that I know what order I'm hoping to do things in. But then I change and skip or move things around if I need to. It depends on the crowd that day, what I end up doing in the end. So I'd create these outlines. And then I would include things like the lyrics to rhymes if I don't have them memorized, stuff like that. And then I would post it right next to me with all of my books and supplies right there. And so if I needed it, I could refer to it. And also I would stack my books in the order that I was going to read them, because I usually stacked mine. Some people put them on display. You could do that too. But I like to stack them so I knew it was coming next. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few of those outlines now. I hope they're not overwhelming to anyone. You can definitely do yours differently, but like I said, I just wanted to give you some examples. Okay, so this is a baby story time outline, very similar to one I have done in the past. And it looks kind of long, but they're all songs and rhymes that are pretty quick. So you can definitely fit this in within about 20 minutes. So you know that hello song that we did at the beginning, we sang that at every story time. And then some very common, you know, Itsy Bitsy Spider, Mary Had a Little Lamb, Twinkle Twinkle. For all of them, because this was a lapset story time, you know, we would have a puppet or a stuffed animal that we would use as our baby. And so we could demonstrate. But a lot of times, like for instance, Twinkle Twinkle, instead of doing all the motions, especially if they had an infant, we were encouraging them to sway or rock their babies. For Mary Had a Little Lamb, they could just kind of do a little knee bounce, or they could clap if the baby was a little older. Itsy Bitsy Spider, they could do the motions, you know, up the baby's leg, things like that, instead of if the baby was quite young. And then when I read a book, it was a very interactive book. The example I used quite often was 10 Tiny Tickles by Karen Katz, because it's literally the parent tickling the baby's head, tickling the baby's back, tickling the baby's arm, things like that. So it was a very interactive book. The other book that's here is Baby Faces by Margaret Miller. We had a set of these in board books, and so I would hand them out and we would give them an opportunity to kind of look at them together. Again, that tactile experience, letting the baby hold it. But there's not a lot of story to those books if you've ever looked at them. It's more just looking at the emotions of the babies and seeing those baby faces. So it's good for the young ones. And then again, a couple more rhymes. Jack Be Nimble, where they could lift the baby up, or over the candlestick, things like that. At the end, we did a circle dance, which was just putting on some song. It could be any song, walking around for 8 or 16 counts, and then in for 4 and out for 4, and then repeating, just to get some more movement. And they could hold and bounce the babies as we did it. Not a long song, just a minute or so. And then the goodbye song. Any questions about baby story time? Or if you do baby story time, do you have something you love to do? Okay. Be thinking of those. If you do baby story times, maybe later on, if you have anything good, you can share it at the end. Erin, yes. Yes, absolutely, Erin. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Peekaboo, that's a great one, Gail. Catherine says lap bouncing, sorry, did not go that well. So we just sing more. That's totally fine too. Totally fine too. For all of these, you got to learn what works for your folks who attend. And if something doesn't work for them, but something else does work, do that. That's okay. Toddler Storytime is the next one. So this one's a little longer, but it is modeled off of a program called Mother Goose on the Loose by Dr. Betsy Diamont Cohen. Any of you, probably several of you have probably heard of Mother Goose on the Loose. Anyone? Yeah, especially those who've been around a little bit longer. So I love her program. I would never have called my Storytime a Mother Goose on the Loose program because I did not do it exactly how she did it, but I used a lot of her elements and her philosophy of just using lots and lots of songs and rhymes and moving pretty quickly through them. So again, you'll see pretty limited book usage here. In fact, I only read one book, and the second book I actually used to show pictures while I sang a song. And most of these, if you don't recognize, so I do an extended version of Open Shut Them for the preschool story time. Two Little Blackbirds, Wiggle Fingers, all these that you may not have seen before. I recorded myself doing them in a video, and I have provided that video on the resource sheet. So I'm not going to sing them all today. We just don't have time, but I do provide them. So if you're curious, you can watch it and see if you want to ever use any of those, including I went to visit the farm one day, which is one I got from Betsy Diamont Cohen and Mother Goose on the Loose. But the idea is that you can show adults that you don't just have to read books, you can use them for other things too. And so you can use any book with good, clear pictures of animals. I went to visit the farm one day, or The Very Busy Spider, sorry, by Eric Carle, because it has some good pictures, and that's what Betsy always did. So you'd show the picture, ask them what the animal is, and then you'd say, I went to visit the farm one day. I saw a cow across the way. And what do you think the cow did say? And then I would also do this with puppets. So that is something you can do. We would hand out manipulatives at the end. We'd play a game with a flannel board called Little Mouse. I did this at every one of my story times because the kids loved it. And I do provide the template for this in the resource sheet. But it's basically 6 houses that you can color in solid colors and a little mouse, and you put some Velcro or cut them out on felt, whatever, and you can stick them to a felt board, and you hide the mouse, and then you say, little mouse, are you in the red house? And you lift it up. No. Little mouse, are you in the blue house? Yay, he's in the blue house. And they would love it. Love it. We do that a few times. Yeah, Jackie. Jackie says that their Storytime kiddos love the little mouse. That's awesome. Let's see. But yeah, again, it's mostly rhyme, song. One book that is very interactive. That's one of my favorites. Hands Can. It starts out, hands can wave to say hello. So you wave. Oh, that's not the right page. And then it says, hands can touch things high and low. There it is. So we'd always go, hands can touch things high and low, right? Something else you can do while you read, just as a side note, is lightly underline the words, just every once in a while. Maybe once or twice a story time, just to point out to kids that you're reading words on a page, you're not reading the pictures. That's not something that you automatically know. And we, like I said, we always use manipulatives with this group. So again, that's anything that children can hold. So in this case, we used scarves and did This Is the Way We Wash Our Elbow. If you've heard that song, we definitely get up and move around, and parents were always in the room, and they were encouraged to sit with their kids on the floor if they were able to. Any questions or comments about this toddler story time? I would use very similar for 1s and 2s, but this general basic structure. All right, I don't see any comments. Gonna keep going. Okay, here's preschool story time. Definitely a heavier importance placed on books this time. There are 3 books here, and they were actual full picture books that I read. Blue Sea is pretty short, and so you'll note that then I would read the story. It's a very simple story, and then I had those pieces like the main characters, the fish, and the holes that they swim through in the book as flannel pieces. And the kids, we'd put the book away after we read it, and the kids would help me retell the story using the flannel pieces. One other thing is that I usually used an owl puppet at every one of my preschool story times. This is the only time I really did like a voice. And Owlie had a little bit of a British accent, and she'd say, "Hello, how are you all today?" And then she would start to talk, and then she'd fall asleep, and then the kids would have to wake her up, and then we'd have a discussion about how, oh, Owlie, owls usually sleep all day and they stay up all night, and so Allie's having a really hard time staying awake for story time, but she's going to try. And then she'd try to talk again and then fall asleep again, and then eventually she'd have to go off and say, have a great story time, but I'm going to go take a nap, and she'd go away. But they enjoyed that, and it was something consistent that they knew about if they came to all the story times. So this is also an example, the flannel board, the 5 little shells rhyme, of how I just put the lyrics right on the sheet. Yeah, and then at the bottom, the dolphin puppet. That's another way to use puppets. Is I really just kind of held it, and I would do Simon Says, but I would say, dolphin says, pat yourself on the head. Dolphin says, stop. Dolphin says, jump up and down. Dolphin says, stop. Like, so the dolphin was there, but I didn't really do a voice with it. So I just want puppets to not be too intimidating for everyone, because they're so much fun and the kids really love them. Yeah, and then we sat down, we did one more story after all that, and then we did the craft and the playtime. Any questions about preschool story time? Okay. Be thinking of your favorite things to do in your story times if you're someone who does story times regularly already. And at the end, I'll definitely want you to share those. Okay, so next I want to share just some other tips that I've come up with through the years, or that I think are important, that I hope you will help, or that I hope will help you with story time. I'm talking too much today. My words are jumbling. Okay, so first of all, practice. This is super duper important. It seems obvious, but I'm someone who doesn't really, I like to know what I'm doing before I do it. I like to practice it so that I feel comfortable. And I know that other folks might be more fly by the seat of their pants, and I'm super jealous of you if you are. But at the very least, I do recommend that you read through your books beforehand. Don't go in blind. Definitely go in having at least read the book a couple times. And early on, especially, you should probably practice reading it out loud also. Figure out where you might want to pause, to point out a picture, to talk about a new word, to have them count or predict what the next page is going to be. And all of that comes with practice. And I do see your question, Madeline. So a flannel board, that is a really good question. So a flannel board is, and many libraries already have them built in somewhere. It's basically a board that has like a flannelly felt on it. And you can stick either things like Velcro will stick to it, but also just buying felt. You can cut out an image that's paper and you can glue it to a piece of felt, or you can just cut out a piece of felt and it'll stick. And so lots of different things you can do with flannel boards. Like I said, you could just, like in that rhyme, the page before here, that flannel board with the 5 little shells, cut out 5 shells. You could use a die cut, you could hand cut them, but 5 shell shapes, you stick them up on the flannel board, and then you would, just take one down every time you are supposed to, according to the rhyme. As far as resources for it, And any sort, like you could buy one, if you don't have one at your library already, you could buy one on Amazon or at any like school or library supply store. I'm sure they have like ones that are kind of on movable display cart sort of things. Easel, that's the word I'm looking for. They have them on like easels. Yeah, that's where you can find it. And then most people just make their own pieces using flannel or by cutting things out, maybe laminating them and putting a little piece of Velcro on them or a magnet. You can also do the same thing on like a whiteboard. If it's magnetic, you could just put a magnet on the back of it and do it that way too. Does that answer your question, Madeline? Ooh, iron transfer sheets, Faith. I like that, to make your flannel pieces. That's a good idea. Okay. All right, so we talked about practicing, definitely really important. The next thing is repetition. Repetition is actually really, really good. Young children are going through a ton of brain development and making new connections between neurons all the time via their synapses. Neurons are the brain cells. Synapses are the connections between brain cells, and it's those connections where learning occurs. The synapses are like paths, really. And the more something is repeated, the stronger that path or connection or synapse is. It's very simplified. I'm not a brain scientist. This is a very simplified version of it. But the bottom line is repetition strengthens these synapses, these connections, and it helps children learn and remember things. So don't be afraid of doing things, at least some of the same songs or rhymes every single week of story time, or very often. You can even repeat the same ones within the same story time. So if you're doing a song or a rhyme that is not kind of in the popular knowledge, so if you're not just doing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you're doing something else, or even if you are doing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you can do it once and then say, okay, let's do that one more time, because the kids will love it. In fact, the more that they do it and the more that they learn it, the more they enjoy doing it because they know it. Does that make sense? We all like to know things, and it makes us feel good if we can participate fully. So that's another good reason for repetition. And I know that it might seem boring to us adults, and we might worry about the parents getting bored, but the fact is it's beneficial for the kids. You can even just straight out tell the parents that that's why you're doing it if you're worried. I used to sometimes say things like, it might seem like we do a lot of the same songs and rhymes and activities every week, but repetition is actually great for the kids' developing brains. And leave it like that. Oh, that's great, Catherine. This next one is one of my favorites. I used to keep a log of all of my story times, including all of the books, rhymes, crafts, and everything that I did during that story time. And I developed a nice collection of solid story times, tweaking them as I went. I'd update a book here, change out a song there. If something didn't, this went really well in this story time, but this other thing, I feel it could be improved, I would make a note of that. And so next time I could replace that with something else. And I would absolutely reuse those story times that worked really well for me. So by the time I left after 12 years of doing story times, I had a nice collection, a nice rotation. I could repeat things every couple of years at that point. Obviously, it does take time to get there, and that's okay. I guess I'm just saying start now and your future self will thank you, probably. Denise, yes, an early literacy calendar is a great idea because they give suggestions for things that they can do together daily to encourage that talking, singing, reading, writing, and playing. Okay. And all that kind of leads to, you're not going to be an expert immediately. It will take time, and it's so okay. Don't worry about it. In fact, it might take a few months or even a few years for you to get really comfortable doing story time. And that's all right. It'll come. It'll come. As far as story times themselves, just a couple more suggestions is that I recommend giving the kids some sort of marker for where to sit if you can. We used carpet squares that we got for free from a local flooring store. We just went in and said, hey, do you have any old carpet samples? We're the library. We want to use them during story time. And they said, oh yeah, sure. There's a pile of them over there. Go ahead and take as many as you want. So we would stack them up and the kids would pick them up and put them down on the floor as they came in. Of course, they do sell fancy ones that are officially made for that in all of the school and the library catalogs. But I like free, and I know that most libraries are similar in that they usually don't have tons of funds. So, okay, good. Yeah. Hula hoops. Oh, wow. Did they play with the hula hoops? That's too tempting. That's probably too tempting. Carpet squares are nice and boring for the most part. I mean, things still happen, but sometimes you can actually even just buy one big rug that has the spots printed on it. So those work too. If you got the money, there's lots of options. The bottom line is it gives them a little space to call their own and to go back to. And you can say things like, all right, everybody, put your bottoms on your carpet squares, or, stay on your carpet square, not Johnny's carpet square, things like that. Yeah, a circle time rug that you can choose to sit on a letter. Those are great. Those are great. It also helps with crowd control, I will add. The next one, somebody asked about this. Set expectations with announcements. Yes, yes, yes. At every one of my story times, I would always make an announcement at the beginning after everyone came in and sat down. Caregivers don't always know what you expect from them or their children. You have to tell them. And yes, the expectations were mostly for the adults. So I would say things like, in fact, this is pretty similar to what I would say. Welcome, everyone. My name is Beth. I'm one of the librarians who does story time here. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. First of all, I want to reassure you that we do not expect your 2-year-old or 1-year-old or whatever. I didn't necessarily say this to the 3 and 5-year-olds, but you absolutely could. We do not expect your 2-year-old to sit still through this entire story time. Developmentally, we know that they need to move. The only time we ask you to do something is if they're trying to get into a craft cabinet, or if they're trying to get behind here to get to my supplies for story time. And if that happens, usually the thing that works best is if you just come, walk over, grab them, and take them back to your spot. So please feel free to do that. And that's as opposed to, maybe staying in your spot and calling to them. It just is a little less disruptive if you just go grab them. I'll know what you're doing. It's okay. If anyone is having a rough day, please feel free to step out with them until they have a chance to calm down a bit. We will absolutely not be offended if you need to leave for a minute. We won't think, oh, why are they leaving story time? We'll understand. In fact, that's usually the least disruptive way to handle meltdowns. And let's face it, we all have meltdowns now and again, so no worries at all. Just step outside of the room and come on back in when your child is ready. We hope that you will join us again. Finally, I'd like to ask all the grown-ups to please put their cell phones away and to try to keep their side conversations to a minimum. We want you to have a chance to chat before or after the story time, but it does help everyone hear what's going on, and you're modeling good listening for the kids if you can avoid those conversations during story time. Okay, let's sing the hello song. Let's all get our hands ready to go. Ready? So yes, it's kind of long, but I wanted to lay out all of the things. The biggest thing is, setting expectations for how we expect their kids to behave, or that we know that they're going to need to move, and that's okay. That we do ask that they step out with them if somebody is having a real hard time, a real meltdown, and that we really want parents to, or caregivers to, turn off their cell phones and not talk to each other during story time because it's super distracting, right? So, and the only issue with that is that sometimes you make the announcements and then people come in afterwards, right? But, you know, at least you try. The next one is prepare to be flexible. I mentioned this before, but even if you have a set program, please try to prepare yourself and be open to changing that outline if the crowd dictates it. Oops. Most of the time it won't be an issue, but you may discover that a particularly wiggly group really needs to get up and move sooner than you planned, or maybe that book just is longer or slower than you thought it would be. So you might need to skip a few pages. And as a side note, it's okay to shorten books. A paper clip is your friend. You just clip together the pages that you want to skip so you can hop right over the stuff you don't want. It works better with some books than others, of course, so practice it beforehand. And sometimes kids will absolutely notice and they will call you out for skipping. That happened to me a couple times. If that happens, though, I just say, oh, we're not going to read those pages today. It's okay. And you keep going. But if a great book is just a little too long, that is an option potentially. And then finally, crowd control. I say here that there is no crowd control. That's not totally true. Obviously, it was for dramatic effect, but some of the things I just mentioned will help with that. Give them a designated spot on the floor, set parental expectations at the beginning, be really flexible and change things up if you need to accommodate that rowdiness. All those things can help a lot. But at the same time, do try to let go of the idea of a group of young children sitting quietly and calmly and listening to every word that you say, because it's probably not going to happen. It might happen occasionally or even most of the time, but there will be times when it does not. They get better at that in kindergarten, and we are their practice zone. We're where they get to practice before they go to kindergarten. So they're learning to sit for longer and longer as they get older. So we have to cut them some slack. I know I had a hard time with this when I first started because I thought I had that dream. Oh, I'm going to do story time and they're all just going to be listening to everything. And of course, that didn't really happen. Again, it happens sometimes and it's wonderful, but there are times when it does not happen. So yeah, just be prepared with lots of songs and dancing and games, and you should hopefully be okay. All right, any questions or other tips that you have that you want to share? You can start sharing them in the chat if you want to, or in just a minute, I'm gonna give you all an opportunity to unmute. I do want to share really fast about the resource sheet before we get to the very, very end. And basically, I am going to put this in the chat. Let me grab the link right now. I'm also going to go ahead and put the LEU request form in the chat. And I see somebody shared, Susan shared. And we will get to that in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and put these in case we get to the end. And I want to make sure everybody has it. So the first one is this link to this Storytime resources sheet that I keep mentioning. You'll see at the top that there is all of the rhymes and the example outlines that I shared here are written out for you if you're interested in them. I also, like I said, recorded myself singing and doing some of the rhymes that you may not be as familiar with. That video link is there, and that little mouse template. And then below that is some general Storytime resources. And as you go down further, there are some on finding diverse books and some on sensory, neurodivergent, differently abled story times. So I wanted to make sure that you had those.